Thanks so much for making some time this morning to join us, and thanks to all of our sponsors, to Clinton Street Theater, and to the entire Creative Morning Portland crew for making this and many other events possible. My name is Eden Redmond. I am an artist, I'm a critical arts writer, and I'm a director at Signal Fire, which is an arts and environmental justice nonprofit based here in Portland, celebrating 10 years in June, and you'll all get your invitation at the end of this presentation. It's funny being asked to speak on the theme of preserve because, what do I know? Preserve is a subject that we expect somebody to speak to with a lot of authority. And who am I to have authority? I am 26. I am currently in my first job right out of graduate school. I'm early in my career. I'm at the beginning of my marriage. I'm at the beginning of my autonomous adulthood, arguably. So who am I to speak about the legacy of preservation? You're all probably asking yourselves the same question now. So when I was feeling anxious about this talk, I decided to flip the question, which is a creative strategy that I use all the time when I'm stuck. What if, instead of being daunted by being underqualified to think about preservation, what if being underqualified was actually a generative position to assert? What if being underqualified, being a novice, means that I have more curiosity to specifically generate questions about preservation? How can subjectivity be something that's useful when thinking about what we preserve? So I'm going to use my newbie perspective to generate as many questions as I can with you throughout my talk today. Not only to share my research process and some behind the scenes thinking, but hopefully to also offer some tools for you when you go home and question all of the paradigms that you uphold after our talk this morning. So when I'm thinking about media studies and when I'm thinking about artwork, when I'm thinking about objects and the visual culture that I am so grateful and lucky to get to write about, when I approach an art object, I think about what cultural narratives are being perpetuated by the artwork or object that I am looking at. And are those legacies something that I am interested in moving forward? Do I want to perpetuate those legacies? Or do I want to actively interrupt the legacy of that artwork? Or do I want to activate it and engage it in a complicating kind of way? Sometimes the stakes are pretty high when thinking about cultural legacy. Sometimes the stakes are seemingly low, but can actually actually are very high. And that is my sweet spot. That's right where I like to work. For example, I wrote a paper about ghost hunters. Have you seen this reality television show on the Travel Channel? It's a gem. I highly recommend it. But the stakes are seemingly low. This is a reality ghost hunting television show. What cultural paradigms, what is being preserved here that we could take seriously? Well, what I wondered is, why is this filmed in night vision? This is a really specific artistic choice that's being made. And sometimes, yes, it is a technical answer to the ghosts come out at night. Yeah, okay, ghosts don't care if it's night, they're there. But it's a really distinct artistic decision that's being made, and it frames the entire way that you consume the show. So I wonder, if Ghost Hunters is filmed in night vision, and if it relies upon a scientific standard of proof, this Western ideology of proving and debunking where ghosts do or may not exist, does that belief undermine other cultural beliefs and faith-based understandings of where spirits and ghosts can live? If we rely on science, are we relying on a Western paradigm of science? And whose understanding of ghosts and spirits get left out when we rely upon that standard as we're viewing this in night vision? So it's a seemingly low expectation, low stakes, but actually it's pretty high stakes. Another project where I use this very fun low-stake, high-stake relationship is for Cabela's World Most Outfitter. This is a photograph from the Cabela's that's down in Tualatin. It's off of exit 289. Please go. This designed piece is honest to goodness titled Conservation Mountain. For those who can't see that. I've written a couple of papers speaking with trophy hunters all around the world. Everyone that I've had the privilege of speaking to has been incredibly generous and communicative and articulate on their views. And it's been really a treat and such a different world to step into as a vegetarian of 19 years. But I look at a scene like this, I look at a storefront and I wonder, what is the role of these taxidermy displays in a retail space? I call these narrative taxidermy displays. And does this narrative taxidermy display visualize what was once man's urge and efforts to dominate nature through hunting and translate it, reimagine it into man's desire to dominate the shopping experience through capital? That is, are we like hunting for bargains instead of hunting for meat or hunting for ghosts? My current example of working in the seemingly low stakes but actually high stakes is a project that I have the honor of writing with my dear collaborator Katie Bush, who's here this morning, studying 9 to 5, the smash hit Woman in the Workplace comedy from 1980, and many other, yeah, and many other women friendship workplace comedy films that came about in the 1980s. So thinking about how comedy specifically gets deployed as a vehicle, and wondering, does using screwball comedy and slapstick humor, does that make it a painless vehicle to deliver feminist ideals and speak about women's equity in the workplace? Or some folks would argue that it actually dilutes the messaging of the feminist agenda. So exploring the nuance that comedy specifically offers, which arguably comedy is the low stakes, but the high stakes of women's equity in the workplace, equal pay, access to childcare, and sexual harassment in the workplace is actually a high stakes dialogue being discussed through a much more accessible point of comedy. How can connecting artists and activists with the wild land interrupt subtler colonial land narratives and generate solutions for restorative land stewardship? This is the part of my life where the stakes look high and they are high. Along with being an artist and a writer, I am the co-director at Signal Fire, and so we take artists and activists camping and backpacking in our remaining wild lands. At Signal Fire, we believe that we can create dynamic networks for land advocacy by joining the unique research skills of artists with the targeted vision and enthusiasm that activists have. And with those groups, we can cultivate deep and authentic relationships with regional indigenous communities, with local environmental campaigns, with local creatives and environmental scientists to build this broad, innovative, grassroots, community-based answer to how do we responsibly engage and protect our wild places and the indigenous people and histories of those places. The stakes are high. So this is when I really realized, like thinking back about my work, why I was freaking out about speaking about preserve. And that's because culturally we give preservation a really tall pedestal. It's that big, tall capital P. And when actually preservation, I think, is a much bigger umbrella that encompasses small, manageable, real-life pieces that we each contribute to every single day, especially as creatives. Let's think about it. Let's take a step back. Broad concept, applicable example. Think about something smaller in your life. Think about your family. Is there a family story about you that gets retold in your family over and over and over and over again? What does that story preserve about your role within your family? How does your family build their own sense of identity through the stories that they choose to tell and choose to retell? For me, that story is when I was 5 and my dad convinced me that I had been doing it all wrong. I was actually dancing as Clara in The Buttcracker, which is a ballet origin story about the beginning of butt cracks. It involves a ballerina falling down. And rather than be upset about the premise of that obvious prank, I was so distraught that I had been learning the steps to the wrong ballet and thought I was going to go on stage and ruin it for everybody. So that story about earnestness and gullibility, it gets retold in my family, and it reifies narratives that I have some feelings about. But this is a really simple example that I hope is a relatable one of how are we preserving our own ideas in really everyday kind of banal ways. We can zoom out a little bit more. Did you go to school? What textbooks did you use? Your history books, your economic books, the literature selections. What kind of stories about power, responsibility, and nation were delivered in those textbooks? Ever watched a movie? Ever watched a movie with a romantic plot? How about a movie with a careerism plot? Who gets to be in the careerism plot? Ever watched a movie with a dog as man's best buddy plot? There are many, many narratives that we preserve through the creative production of films about power, about responsibility, about loyalty, about community. Where did you first see these ideas? Okay, so many of us have a few reference points for how things get preserved around us and how we kind of walk through things that are preserved for us. But let's talk about when you get to make the decision to preserve something. Do you have family photo albums? Could your family afford to have photos taken? Did your family have the material security to keep photos over time? How did your grandparents decide which photos to keep? Do you keep your own family photo album? How does that decision change now that your family photos are on Instagram? And this is the pivotal point where I think that creatives actually have a ton of agency, and I would argue responsibility to recognize the cultural influences that shape the things that we are making. And I know I'm pulling a lot from family examples and lived experience right now, but let's illustrate how lived experience shapes the creative objects that we choose to make. How do creatives decide, define, and design what we preserve? When I come across a piece of media or an art object, I think about who decided to keep this. Sometimes, if it's a particularly upsetting one, I'm like, who greenlit this project? And who defines how it got made? Who defines how it was produced at all? How do those deciders define what's worth keeping in the final product? And how was that definition designed for a public audience and for distribution? None of these questions have easy answers. And it starts with the decision to make something. So I want to break it out to today's icebreaker question, thinking about what we collect. How do we start that beginning decision of gathering things, of assembling things, of building our own visual lexicon, and building our own archive that we preserve that inform our creative decision making? Do we have any brave volunteers who want to share what they collect? Mugs. Are these your mugs up here today? Pencils. Did I hear postcards too? Cute shit. Sorry? Rocks. Excellent. Yeah. And you know, like, the cute shit gets a giggle, but that aesthetic sensibility, that curatorial decision that we're making about what we want to take on, that matters, and it's informed by our cultural position in the world. So, in my own life, I am a chronic eavesdropper, and I collect random phrases. You can call me nosy. It's okay. It's fine. But there are a couple of important things to know about my subjectivity and how I move through the world that informs why I collect random phrases. And there are three reasons for this. One is because I had an illness when I was younger that took about 60% of the hearing on my left-hand side. So sometimes when I'm in a public space, I'll just kind of eavesdrop and see, like, how far can I hear? What's the acoustic understanding of the space? Am I ever going to be able to hear that stuff again? My proximal hearing's really terrible. I have a really hard time distinguishing what direction a sound is coming from. Please remember that during the Q&A. Also, my second reason for eavesdropping is for all of the privilege that I hold as a white cis woman walking through the world. People still feel entitled to address and access my body in public spaces. And so I have been through enough shit on the street that I get to eavesdrop for the sake of my own safety, okay? And that shows you how my life experience and social status shape what I choose to collect, and in turn, what artwork I make from those collections. These little throwaway pieces of dialogue become windows into strange realities that I get to look into. I get to see these tiny joys and dramas and confusing pieces throughout the day. So out of my own safety, I began eavesdropping. But now that I've begun eavesdropping, my third motivation, I love it. I love eavesdropping. I get to hear all kinds of confusing things, all kinds of odd things, sometimes upsetting things, peculiar things, and pulling those out of context, getting a little slice into somebody's life, really makes me think about my position, the perspective I'm walking through, and how does a throwaway piece of text that I walk by change when I choose to preserve it? Something that would be totally discardable to anybody else. What if I make the choice to hang on to it for a second? How does it change? So this is a series of artwork that I did where I collected overheard phrases. I made an intaglio plate on copper, and I printed these overheard phrases onto this really delicate, this really water-vulnerable Sekishu mulberry paper, and then I hid them in community bulletin boards, hoping that people could get the same serendipitous experience that I did of encountering it by surprise, but also you're forced to pause in a different way when it's a visual object as opposed to just hearing it in passing. I wanted to replicate that experience for other folks. So this is one that I overheard that was a little funny. Unlike my father's death, which was so uncool. I have no idea what the context is for that one. The others I do know, but I'm not going to tell you because that ruins the point of the artwork. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're a little concerning, awkward, bewildering. If you hear cracking, you may be doing it right. Sometimes they can be scary. She said no, so I walked in. Yeah, that's pretty scary to hear out of context. Or, because it's out of context, they could have been responding to an emergency situation. She said no, so I knew I needed to go in. I don't know. It's that removal and that decision to preserve that changes the entire understanding of the text. So what we collect matters. That creative impulse to gather things matters. And a lot of it comes from this natural artistic sense of, I like this is valuable to me. But in that deciding, we're making thousands and thousands and thousands of micro decisions as we go. And that's really valuable. That's super valuable. Artists spend decades honing their visual filters. That's why I went to art school, was to learn how to make those filters more precise. I had been making art always. For as long as I can remember, I had the great privilege of going to a private high school where I got to study art on an art concentrated track. And not just because we didn't have to take PE, but I got to study art in high school. I studied art in undergrad, and then my parents were really shocked and thrilled when I said I wanted to go into the arts professionally. But when I got into college, some things changed. I had this idea of how I wanted to pursue making art, but when I got there, I took my first art history and art theory classes, and that's when I realized that what I actually cared about more than me making art was the conversations that were catalyzed after experiencing art. Getting to read art history texts that expand across decades, getting to speak through time about the cultural implications and decisions to preserve and continue to discuss an artwork, that was way more interesting than me making my own paintings. When I got there, I met these babes. This is the Bad Girls Club, the founding members. This is Kelly Brand, who graduates with her master's from PNCA soon, yeah. Rebecca Hanley, Olivia No, and that's me way on the edge there, Eden Redmond. And I know you're wondering, yes, we did all cut our own bangs. I know it's hard to tell, we sure did. Oh, man. So I met these kids, and I met that teacher. I met that teacher, that one that really ignites your brain, the one that makes you wonder why any other teacher you've had before even considers themselves qualified to be in a classroom. I met these folks, and I met that teacher, and I learned the value of discourse. I learned the value of discourse. I learned what it meant to take an essay, to take an artwork, and to talk about it with your friends, and how that could really activate broader social engagement and dialogue. For the bad girls, we were all coming of age. We were really thinking about how ideals of femininity and girlhood were super, super constructed. And we decided some of those constructions feel very restrictive, some of them feel very exciting. So what if we push it? What if we push those constructions, turn it up to 11, and see what happens? And one of the best ways that we did that was at all of our exhibitions, we had the pink food table. So at all of our openings, we had this table that was covered entirely in pink. Pink cupcakes, pink potato chips, they exist. Pink drinks, just seeing how this branding proliferates into the public, and what's the difference when you encounter kind of like a typically beautifully arranged charcuterie board at an art opening versus like pink cupcakes and potato chips at an art opening. So I met these folks, I had these incredible conversations, and I realized that through this discourse, that was the work that I was much more excited about and what I really wanted to pursue. So I packed up my art history tools, and I packed up my art theory tools, and I went to graduate school. With this newly defined love of art history and art theory, I went to graduate school for visual and critical studies, which is exactly what it sounds like. We get to write and investigate the visual world that we move through. I spent my thesis writing about still life. I know, it's like such a painting, it's such an archetype, like what is there to study in a contemporary context? Okay, so still life actually is a super, super rich genre. The still lifes were produced in northern, so we're gonna take a teeny tiny step into art history. We'll come back, I promise. For those of you who snoozed through the occasional art history class, it's okay. The still life was produced in the 17th and 18th century in Northern Europe, and these paintings were commissioned as Dutch colonizers were returning to Northern Europe with the spoils of colonization. So all of the fine meats, fruit, metals, sugary pastries were all brought back to Northern Europe to grow the upper and middle classes, to proliferate this wealth into a system, but they were all the results of colonial violence in the West Indies, in South America, in Northern Africa, in Southern Africa. So these paintings were commissioned to celebrate the material wealth that people were bringing home, but in that they were celebrating the spoils of conquest. When I was younger, I saw these images and I really valued them just for their physical production. I mean, that is an exquisite artwork. It is incredibly rendered. But with my new art historical and art theoretical lens, I realized that these paintings were commissioned solely to celebrate the economic growth born of colonial violence, born of the violence inflicted upon others. So those paintings were made because they thought those spoils and those actions to get those spoils were worth preserving. And what kind of culture values colonial dominance and will commission thousands and thousands of paintings with thousands and thousands of dollars? And not only that, but museums will go to great lengths to conserve and preserve these images, which means that we continue to value that colonial conquest and violence over time. This is an example of an object that was born of a cultural framework, and because that object exists, it continues to perpetuate a cultural framework and preserve those ideas. Y'all with me? So how do we define what is preserved here? Is there a way to reimagine the still life without promoting that colonial legacy that it was built upon? Or rather, can we understand the still life in a way, if we understand it as an object that shows economic class and material value and cultural values of the time, what would a contemporary still life show you? What would a millennial still life show you? This is an artwork called Existential Crisis by Hobbes Ginsburg, who is a self-described, non-binary, low-key, sad girl who uses she, her pronouns. And this is part of a series of 12 photographs that was the subject of my master's thesis, thinking through what do we learn from a millennial still life? What do we learn about the cultural value, the economic snapshot of the time, and the material values of that time? This photograph was staged, taken by a digital camera, and disseminated onto Tumblr, almost exclusively. The only way that you could encounter this suite of photos was scrolling late at night in your bed, the Tumblr feed. That is the purest way to access Tumblr, by the way. Until recently, it only existed digitally, so you could only see it by chance. It's both a very careful and a pretty casual arrangement. Let's take a second to check out some of the goodies we got in here with my trusty laser pointer. Yeah, we've got this pink silicone vibrator, which, as if that wasn't enough, there's a smiley face ring placed over the clitoral stimulator. Wait, what's the sign for clitoral stimulator? No? Yeah? Thank you. It's better than I ever imagined. Oh my gosh. True, to each their own. We have a magic date ball here. We have a bedazzled pipe just below the magic date ball. We have this sad bunch of daisies. We have this like pretty princess plastic gold chalice. We have a Victory candy cigarette box. It says candy right up front, but obviously there's a little real cigarette hidden in there. So this object has a lot of the trappings of a historical still life. It has fabric, it has sugary sweets, it has indulgent foods and activities placed before you, but there's an incredibly different economic picture that's being snapped here. They're still valuable, they just show a different set of values and an insight into a different life. Hobbes is a millennial. These objects are the things that my Bad Girls Club and I find under our beds that we can't reconcile giving up over years and years. They're childlike objects that in an adult context, in this transitional context of adolescence and adulthood, take on a different meaning. Many millennials, especially artistic millennials, seeking work after the post-2008 the post-2008 recession, the economy just wasn't there to support folks getting a job. So you stayed home. You lived at home. You made artwork at home. Many of us are still at home. Well, and so the like adult spoils and celebrations of this like economic growth and development that's happening in the Dutch still life isn't necessarily happening for Hobbes. She's of such a different economic standing, a different cultural moment. Look at the quality of the objects, these plastic, throwaway, disposable objects. What happens when we consider junk with the same kind of care that we consider the fine goods of the Dutch still life? So I think she's making really poignant work here, and I think it's saying a lot about the millennial economy, contemporary makers' position in the economy, and a lot about girlhood and the expectations of growing up in the post-2008 recession. But even though she goes against the grain in so many ways, I think she's still participating in a capitalist system of acquisition. Because Tumblr is this website where you scroll, you scroll, you scroll, you scroll, you click, you like, you repost, you collect. You make decisions and you define what goes into your virtual archive. And that process of looking and acquiring is very much parallel to the capitalist process of shopping and acquiring. But millennials don't necessarily have the economic tools to go into the mall and shop and acquire things. So the next best thing is to acquire digital things. to acquire digital objects. You're replicating the same kind of system, you're placating that desire to acquire, but without the resource of money to go acquire physical objects. I'll also break open the conversation to say this is by far, this conversation is not limited to millennials, of course. Hobbes does something really incredible here. She takes the expectations of the still life, she takes that frame, and she fills it with a different content. And it's worth archiving. As I said before, Hobbes identifies herself as a non-binary, low-key, sad girl, as a queer person. And she recently said in an interview that the reason she made these images is to celebrate each life, each year, she didn't kill herself. This series is called Still Alive. It's a tattoo she has on her wrist to remind herself every day that she's still here. What kind of snapshot do these still lives offer? What kind of ideals do they preserve? So thinking about deciding and defining to keep something, how do we design what we want to preserve moving forward? You're all familiar with the grid? It's so ubiquitous, it's used in many, many industries. The grid offers order, perspective, and legibility. But what happens when you put a grid on top of this? So as I said, I work for Signal Fire Arts, a nonprofit here based in Portland. We take artists and activists out to the backcountry because our cultural relationships with the land are really fraught. And I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples why. Thomas Jefferson's Land Ordinance of 1785 literally inscribed a national grid as a mechanism for settling and selling land. Before this land ordinance was designed, land surveyors would mark out land with the chop of an axe into a tree, with stacked rock cairns, with river bends. But of course, all of those examples are things that are transmutable. They're movable, they're impermanent, and landowners and prospective landowners would quabble about it all the time. So Jefferson decided, in anticipation of settling, how do we get ahead of this issue to grid out the entire settleable country? But the grid is really powerful because it's so abstracting. It's very linear and literal and gridded out, but what it actually does is flatten and abstract the complicated landscape. It does not yield to the incline of a mountain. It does not shift with the boundaries of a forest and meadow. It does not move as deer and salmon migrate through it in the spring. The grid is solid. This map also offers a couple of other important tools, including a God's eye perspective that is impossible to achieve with the typical human eye before we went to space. Nobody gets to see land from this perfectly aerial view. Even in airplanes and with drones, you still get a sense of perspective and distance, but this flattened, gridded view empties out the land. All we see here is boxes. It empties all of the wildlife there, all of the natural movements there, and any indigenous communities who may live there, rendering those things an obstacle in the way of settling and selling that land. This is a visual tool that was designed to literally empty and parcel the land, priming it for settler colonial conquest and acquisition. Need another example? This is one of my favorites that I learned from the West Wing. Anybody? When the cartographers for social justice come and pitch C.J. Craig on a new world map. You've probably seen both of these before. These are real maps, although I'm sad to say the cartographers for social justice is an imaginary. It's an imaginary organization, sorry. You've seen this map before, but the point that's made in that episode and that's made through the grid of this map is look at how the proportions are different. This Mercator projection came first. It came before the Gauss-Peter projection. Look at how large North America is, how large the Siberian tundra in Russia is, how large Europe and Asia are. When the Gauss-Peters projection is actually a much more accurate to scale map by the size of the continents. How does your perception of space change when you see that the southern hemisphere continents are much larger than the northern hemisphere continents? Culturally, we hold a top-to-bottom hierarchical balance. What that means is we think stuff that's on top is more important than stuff that's on bottom. We also have a bigger is better bias. Things that are bigger are better than things that are smaller. And so if you continue to depict a map that shows Northern Hemisphere colonial countries as larger and dominant on top, it does encourage a colonial bias across our textbooks. But what do we do about the top to bottom thing? We can't help that North America is north and South America is south, so how do we switch that? Well, north and south don't matter on a galactic scale. The Earth floating in the universe, north and south doesn't matter. It's only a perspective that matters to those of us standing on Earth. How does your understanding of where you are change looking at that? So how do we go out into our wild places in the Pacific Northwest responsibly? At Signal Fire, we have a few responses to this question. First, we refer to the lands that we're visiting by bioregion name, trying to perforate the colonial boundaries of statehood. Second, we make sure that all of our reading materials on our trips are well stocked with writings from Indigenous members of those regions, and we also cultivate deep and authentic relationships with Indigenous communities in those regions so that we can meet up with Native folks on the trail and have conversations and dialogue and hikes with them to recenter the Native histories of those places. Third, we just get people out onto the land. 1 to 5 weeks of camping will radically change how you think about the city that you're walking around in the day-to-day. Where is your water coming from in the city? You think about it differently when you have to source your own water out in the wild. Who was on your city land before you? In 2016, Signal Fire really concentrated these questions with our programmatic theme, Unwalking the West. That is, every trip that we ran that year literally walked in reverse the Lewis and Clark and Oregon Trail settler trails, not only as a poetic and artistic gesture, but also to root people to the location of colonial settlements in the Northwest. All of our trips were designed to interrogate that impact and physically locate them in the regions that we were in. We wanted to recenter, educate about the colonial history, but recenter the indigenous experience and contemporary indigenous experience of those places. Our model hinges on a couple of different beliefs, one of which is the understanding that artists and creators are uniquely receptive researchers. So we think that artists are keenly observant, they are dedicated to recording, and they have a unique way of embodying the space that they're in and teaching those lessons. The second main belief that we have is that activists are incredibly motivated and organized folks who design incredible campaigns and metrics for cultural change. Not only do they have the ideas for change, but they design the campaigns, the visuals, the outreach, the conversation templates to implement and effectuate that change. We also find that both artists and activists are deeply rooted in their own communities. They tend to be educators, they tend to be teachers, parents, sometimes representatives. They tend to be organizers, deeply embedded in their communities. And so if we can take artists and activists to the backcountry and get them to care about our remaining wild lands, they will take that care back to their own communities and be ambassadors for conscientiousness around the land and land stewardship. Sometimes that looks like creating an exhibition. This is a show that we did last year, curated by Kaila Farrell-Smith, and this was exhibited at PNCA, and this was all, it was called Unwalking the West. It was all artists who came on any one of our trips in that 2016 Unwalking the West year. Sometimes they get to educate the public through art exhibitions. Sometimes alumni artists are inspired to publish their work in writings or publish artwork in journals. This is our journal that we produce every year. This was the one that corresponded with that Unwalking the West theme last year. Sometimes Signal Fire artists and local activists join forces with Indigenous youth to gather at the state capitol and ask Governor Kate Brown to deny the permits for the Pembina pipeline that's proposed to have an export terminal at Jordan Cove. There we are. What a good-looking bunch. Actually, the Jordan Cove, are folks familiar with the proposed Pembina pipeline running out to Jordan Cove? Yeah, so it's proposed to connect with the Ruby pipeline down in the southeastern corner of Oregon in Malin and run over 290 miles all the way across the state from east to west with an export terminal in Jordan Cove. And so that is 292 miles of liquid gas getting pushed across the state under almost 300 waterways in the state. It's really a dangerous proposal. And Jordan Cove itself is a massively active tectonic zone. So why not put a gas export terminal there? We're really proud and excited about the work that we're doing, but we know there's still a lot more work to do. Recently, one of the dredging permits that was proposed to the DEQ for Jordan Cove got struck down, due in part to this incredibly organized group at the No LNG Exports campaign, but there's still strides to do, and you can learn more about it at nolngexports.org. Signal Fire does a lot, and so we're having a big old party in a couple of weeks to celebrate 10 years of doing all of that stuff. On Saturday, June 8th, we're having a party at C3 Initiative up in the St. John's neighborhood. It's also the last soiree that C3 is having in that space before they move into their newly purchased facility in the Park Blocks in downtown Portland. So we'll be there, we'll have live music, Cayenne Pepper is our MC, we have super, super generous vendors who've given us food. You all should come, it's open to the public, you're super welcome to join. We have a beautiful silent auction. And if you can't make it, we are selling raffle tickets online for a gorgeous print that's being auctioned off at the event. So how do creatives decide, define, and design what we preserve? I hope that it is by being vigilant about our own perspectives. I hope it's by sharing our work and being receptive to feedback from our communities and other communities. And I hope it's by revisiting our own projects, and I hope most importantly, we do it together. Thank you.